At 3:47 hours. A drainage ditch beneath a hedgerow, 300 meters west of Saint-Lô, Normandy. July 11, 1944, mud in his mouth, mud in his ears. The hedgerow above him breathed with gunfire. Private Jubal Calloway did not move. 6 feet away, a German patrol walked the top of the bocage wall, boots crushing wet grass, rifles low and ready. One flashlight swept the ditch and stopped 4 inches short of his boots. He had 4 seconds before it swept back. His right hand moved to his boot. No, not his boot. His palm. He pressed his thumb into the old scar there, a habit older than the war itself, and something in his chest went still the way it always did right before he made a decision that couldn't be unmade. Remember that gesture. You don't know what it means yet. You will. The flashlight swept back. He was already moving. What happened in the next 90 seconds along that hedgerow would be reported, badly, incompletely, and reluctantly, in a battalion log that misspelled his name. It would not be reported the way it actually happened. It would not mention the rifle he built out of 3 broken weapons and a dead man's optics. It would not mention what his own sergeant called him 3 days earlier. It would not mention the 29. By the time the sun came up over that hedgerow, a German officer who had never lost a position in 5 years of war would radio his command post and ask a question nobody could answer. Who is doing this? This is the story the report never told. If you're still here, drop a comment with one word: Hedgerow. Let's see how many of us make it to the end. Here is the shape of the trap, laid out plainly, because you need to understand exactly how impossible this was before you're allowed to believe what comes next. The bocage country of Normandy was never meant to be a battlefield. Farmers had spent 400 years building earthen walls between their fields, packing them with root systems until each hedgerow was less a hedge and more a fortress wall. 3 feet of dirt and stone, crowned with brush, cutting visibility to almost nothing. The U.S. 29th Infantry Division had been grinding through this country for 5 weeks, and every single field cost blood measured in hours, not days. By July 11th, Calloway's platoon had been reduced from 38 men to 11. Command's solution was to push forward regardless of the MG-42 nest dug into the northeast corner of the next field. Regardless of the fact that a German MG-42 fires 1,200 rounds a minute, nearly triple the American Browning, and that the hedgerow gave the gunner total cover while giving the Americans nothing but open, chewed-up grass to cross. For 10 hours, Lieutenant Colonel Everett Marsh, reviewing the map by red flashlight, told his company commanders the next field was unavoidable. 11 men, 1 functioning Browning. No armor support. The Shermans were bogged down 2 fields back, engines flooded from the night's rain. No air support until first light, still 90 minutes out. Enemy POV. Hartman does not look up from his coffee when the runner reports unusual movement in the drainage ditch below field 12. Movement is constant here. Rats, wounded men crawling, wind through wheat nobody has harvested in a month. He tells the runner to log it and stop wasting his time. 5 years of war have taught him that panic is contagious and useless. He has held this stretch of hedgerow for 11 days against 3 separate American pushes. He does not yet know the name Calloway. He will not forget it by morning. Back in the ditch, Calloway heard his squad leader, Sergeant Delacroix, say the words that would define the next 4 hours. "We don't have a play here, Calloway. We wait for daylight and we lose more men doing it. There's no clean way through that field." Calloway had already stopped listening. He was looking at the wreckage scattered along the ditch. A shattered Kar 98K sniper rifle, its stock split but its barrel true. His own M1 Garand, half jammed with mud, and 40 yards back, a dead paratrooper's Thompson, drum magazine still half full, its owner beyond needing it. Nobody else saw a way through that field. He was already building one. Some things about desperate men and broken weapons are true in every war, in every country, on every field where the plan stopped working. This was about to become one of the loudest examples of it in the entire Normandy campaign, and almost nobody would ever hear the full story. Consider the raw imbalance one more time, because the numbers matter. The German position held a fixed MG-42 with a sustained rate of fire that could shred an advancing platoon in under 30 seconds. It held 8 additional riflemen armed with the Carabiner 98K, a weapon prized for its accuracy at range. In a defensive position, they had improved for 11 straight days, interlocking fields of fire, sighted lanes cut through the hedgerow brush, ammunition stockpiled and dry. Calloway had a jammed rifle, a wounded arm not yet even injured but soon to be, 41 rounds scattered across 3 broken weapons, and a stretch of exposed field between himself and anyone who could help him. 12 German riflemen and machine gunners. 1 American. Do that math. Command's math said the field was unwinnable before daylight. Command's math was about to be proven catastrophically wrong by a man they had spent 2 years underestimating. 355 hours. Sergeant Delacroix made one final radio attempt to raise battalion command for artillery support, and got nothing but static. The same static that had plagued the unit's equipment, since a supply truck carrying replacement radio parts had been destroyed by a German air raid 3 days earlier. It was one more piece of a puzzle stacking entirely against them. No radio, no armor, no air cover, no reinforcements, and now, no way to even ask for help. Whatever happened in that field next would happen with the resources already scattered across the mud around them and nothing else. Before the mud, before the war, before anyone called him a soldier at all, Jubal Calloway was a blacksmith's son in Coweta County, Georgia, and his whole childhood smelled like coal smoke and hot iron. The forge sat behind the house, a low stone building his grandfather had built with his own hands after buying his freedom papers back in the 1870s. By the time Jubal was 7, he knew the sound of good steel from bad steel just by the ring of the hammer. His father, Ezra Calloway, was not a man who explained things twice. He'd hand Jubal a piece of scrap iron, point at the forge, and say, "Fix it or feed it to the fire. Either way, learn something." His father never said he was proud. He just handed him the wrench. That's where the scar came from, the one on his right palm, the one that would become the most repeated gesture of his entire war. He was 9 years old, reaching too fast for a horseshoe that hadn't cooled the way he thought it had. His father didn't rush to bandage it. He held Jubal's wrist steady, looked at the burn, and said, "Now you'll always know what heat feels like before it hurts you." He wrapped it himself, slow and careful, and told him that a scar like that was a tool if you let it be, a reminder to slow down half a second before you commit to anything. Jubal ran his thumb across that scar for the rest of his life before every decision that mattered. He didn't know it yet, but the U.S. Army was about to give him a great many decisions that mattered. His mother, Odessa Calloway, worried about the forge from the day Jubal was born. She'd lost a cousin to a kick from a spooked mule and never fully trusted anything with that much heat and iron in it. But she never once told her son to stay away from his father's work. Instead, she'd bring water out to the forge on the hottest afternoons, set it down without a word, and watch her son's hands for a moment before going back inside. Years later, in a letter he received 2 weeks before the Normandy invasion, a letter he kept folded in his breast pocket through everything that followed, she wrote him just one line about the war. "Whatever they ask of you, do it the way your daddy taught you, slow enough to get it right the first time." He read that line so many times the crease wore through the paper before the war was 6 weeks old. The abuse started the day he enlisted and never really stopped. At Fort Benning, a training sergeant took one look at his enlistment paperwork. Callaway, Jubal E., blacksmith, Coweta County, GA, and told the rest of the platoon, loud enough for everyone to hear, that they'd finally found someone qualified to shoe the mules. It got worse from there. He was assigned to weapons maintenance not because anyone valued his obvious mechanical genius, but because it kept him out of sight, elbow-deep in grease where, as one corporal put it, using a word Jubal had heard his whole life and would keep hearing in uniform, his kind belonged. He fixed rifles that officers swore were unfixable. He never got credit in writing. Twice, white privates who'd merely handed him a broken weapon took the commendation for its repair. He said nothing. He kept his head down, kept fixing things, and kept his hands moving, because his hands moving was the one place nobody could take anything from him. He built his first true hybrid weapon almost by accident, in basic training, splicing a cracked M1 Garand receiver with parts salvaged from 2 other washouts to make one working rifle out of 3 broken ones. His platoon sergeant found it, said nothing about who'd built it, and quietly requisitioned it for himself. That was the moment Jubal Callaway understood something about the Army that would carry him through the entire war. Nobody was going to hand him credit. So he stopped needing it. He started building things purely because they were true, because a good weapon, like a good horseshoe, either worked or it didn't, and steel doesn't care what color the hands are that shape it. There was a corporal at Fort Benning named Willis Doughty who came closest to being a friend in those early months, a white farm boy from Tennessee who'd grown up around his own family's blacksmith and recognized real skill when he saw it. Doughty was the only man in that training company who ever called Jubal by his first name instead of a slur or a nickname meant to diminish him. He didn't make it past the beaches at Omaha 5 weeks before Field 12. Jubal carried that loss the same quiet way he carried everything else, no outward grief, just one more weight added to hands that had already learned to keep working through pain rather than stop and feel it. The scar came from home. The silence came from the Army. And somewhere between the two, a soldier was built who would rather be underestimated 100 times than explain himself once. He carried nothing from home into that hedgerow except the scar on his palm, and everything his father had taught him about heat, pressure, and the exact moment before something breaks. There was one more piece of that Georgia childhood that mattered more than any of the others, and it had nothing to do with rifles at all. When Jubal was 12, a summer storm had torn through the county and flattened half the fence line separating the Callaway property from the Whitfield farm next door. Ezra Callaway, without being asked, spent 3 days rebuilding not just his own fence but half of the Whitfields as well, stitching broken rail to broken rail with whatever scrap lumber and iron brackets he could scrounge, because, as he told his son, a fence that only protects your own side of the line isn't worth building at all. Jubal never forgot the word his father used for that kind of repair work: stitching. Taking what's broken on both sides and making one thing whole enough to hold. He would use that same word, without realizing where it came from, to describe what he did in the hedgerows of Normandy nearly 20 years later. He was about to need every bit of it. For 21 hours, Sergeant Delacroix Hayes gave the order to hold position and wait for daylight. Then he took the 4 able-bodied men left in the squad and pulled back toward the previous hedgerow, telling Callaway he'd send word when reinforcements arrived. No word ever came. Whether it was a miscommunication or a decision made in fear, no official record ever clarified, and Callaway never spoke about it afterward either way. He was alone, cut off. No radio that worked. No backup. 8 German riflemen and 1 MG-42 crew stood between him and the rest of his division, and the nearest American position was 400 yards of exposed field behind him. His first attempt to move, a low crawl along the ditch toward better cover, nearly killed him. By 05:02, A burst from the MG-42 caught the ditch wall 18 inches from his head, and a fragment of stone tore open his left forearm to the muscle. He pressed mud into the wound because he had nothing else, wrapped it with a strip torn from his undershirt, and kept moving because stopping meant bleeding out in a ditch nobody would find until the war was over. At 05:40, he found the wounded German soldier. The man was young, maybe 19, shot through the hip during the earlier exchange, dragging himself toward what he thought was cover. He was not a threat. He could barely lift his rifle, and Calloway, watching the MG-42 position from 40 yards away, understood immediately that the wounded man's movement, desperate, visible, crawling toward the tree line, would draw the gun crew's attention exactly where Calloway needed it drawn. He did not warn the man. He did not signal him. He simply let him keep crawling, timed his own movement to the German gunner's attention shifting toward the easier target, and used those 4 seconds of cover to close half the distance across the field. The wounded soldier was killed by his own side's gun crew, mistaken in the chaos and dim light for an advancing threat. Calloway never wrote about this. It does not appear in any account he gave because he never gave one. It happened. That is all that can be said about it here. 6:03 hours. He reached the ditch debris, the cracked car 98K, his jammed Garand, the dead paratrooper's Thompson, and understood that the only way through the next 400 yards was a weapon that didn't exist yet. His hands moved the way his father's had moved over a forge, without hesitation, without wasted motion. He stripped the car 98K down to its barrel and bolt Mauser engineering, brutally accurate past 300 yards, a barrel true enough to thread a needle. He cannibalized the trigger group and semi-automatic action from his own Garand, because a bolt-action rifle in a 400-yard sprint under fire was a death sentence. You needed follow-up shots without breaking your sightline. And from the Thompson, he pulled the drum magazine housing, rebuilding the feed mechanism with a section of leather boot lace and a filed-down cartridge casing as a makeshift pin, giving himself 30 rounds before reload instead of 8. The scope was the problem. He had no scope. What he had was a signal mirror from a downed pilot's survival kit, found 3 days earlier and kept for no reason he could explain at the time. He notched it into a bracket bent from a bayonet mount, angled to catch just enough reflected light to sight along hedgerow gaps without exposing his head above the wall. A trench periscope trick as old as the First War, married to a rifle nobody had ever built before. His scarred palm worked the metal the entire time, the old burn aching in the cold, and he pressed his thumb into it once hard before threading the final pin home. Fix it or feed it to the fire. The first test came at 06:15, aimed at a fence post 80 yards out. The shot cracked true, punched clean through, and the rifle cycled its next round without jamming. Enemy POV. Hartman receives the report of a single, precisely placed shot from an angle his gun crews cannot explain, fired from a position with no clean sightline, using a rifle report that matches nothing in the American arsenal his men have cataloged. He tells his second-in-command, Lieutenant Braun, to reposition the MG-42 crew and increase the patrol along the ditch. For the first time in 11 days, Hartman feels something he does not have a word for yet. He orders coffee. He does not drink it. By 06:40, 3 German patrols had swept the ditch and found nothing but mud and a dead paratrooper's empty ammunition belt. Calloway had already moved 40 yards north, using the hedgerow's shadow line, the stitch, as he would later half-joke to a medic weaving low along the base of the wall where the wheat still stood tall enough to break his silhouette. Twice in those 40 yards he nearly gave himself away. A patrol dog, somewhere off to his left, caught a scent and pulled hard against its handler's leash before being yanked back toward the main position. The handler, thankfully, more interested in his own breakfast than in a dog's nose. Then, Crossing a narrow gap between hedgerow sections, Calloway's boot caught a coil of abandoned telephone wire, and he went down hard onto his wounded arm, biting back a sound that would have ended everything in that instant. He lay flat in the wheat for 11 full seconds, listening to his own pulse hammer in his ears, before he trusted himself to move again. He came close to collapse twice, once from blood loss, once from something closer to grief, kneeling in the wheat with his wounded arm shaking too hard to steady the rifle. He thought about the wounded German soldier. He thought about Sergeant Delacroix's walking away. He thought about a training sergeant's voice calling him fit only to shoe mules. He reached into his boot, not for anything, just to feel the leather, to remember his father's hands wrapping a burn without rushing, and pressed his scarred palm flat against the earth instead. Something in him went quiet, the same stillness from the ditch at 3:47. Then he stood up, checked the rifle's action one final time, and moved toward the MG-42 position. He had 11 rounds left in the Thompson drum, a rifle that shouldn't exist, and every reason in the world to stay down. That's the number worth remembering. 11 rounds, one rifle held together with a boot lace and a filed cartridge casing. 11 German soldiers he still had to get past before this field belonged to anyone but the men who'd held it for 11 days. You'll understand in a moment why that number kept doubling back on him all morning, but not yet. He didn't stay down. 1 rifle, 3 guns cannibalized, 0 backup. Comment the stitch if you understand the title now. Subscribe for the climax. 6:51 hours. The MG-42 crew never saw him. Calloway came along the hedgerow shadow, low and slow, the mirror sight catching just enough gray dawn light to place his first shot through the gunner's shoulder before the man could pivot the weapon. The assistant gunner reached for the grip and took the second round through the chest. 2 men down in under 3 seconds, and the gun that fired 1,200 rounds a minute, the gun that had pinned an entire American company for 5 weeks, went silent. The first peak. Something impossible had just succeeded. Then it nearly fell apart. A third German soldier, alerted by the burst of fire, came around the hedgerow wall from the flank Calloway hadn't cleared. The rifle's makeshift feed jammed on the 14th round. The leather lace pin had slipped under the heat and repeated cycling. And for 4 seconds, Calloway had no working weapon, a torn arm, and a soldier 8 feet away raising a rifle. He closed the distance with the rifle itself, using the Kar 98K barrel as a club, taking a glancing blow to the ribs that would leave 3 of them cracked. He got the man down. He didn't have time to feel anything about it. He reseated the pin with his teeth and his good hand, cycled the action and kept moving. The second peak. It had nearly collapsed completely. For a moment, kneeling over the man he'd just put down, Calloway's hands would not stop shaking. It wasn't the cracked ribs. It was the accumulation of every hour since 3:47, the wounded German soldier he'd let die in the ditch, the sergeant who'd walked away and never sent word, the weight of being one man asked to do what should have taken a platoon. He pressed his palm flat against the wet earth, felt the old scar sting the way it always did, and made himself breathe for 4 full seconds before standing back up. 4 seconds. The same 4 seconds he'd had in the ditch at 3:47, come back around to find him again. 7:06 hours. Word had reached the rest of the German position that something was moving through the hedgerows, and 8 riflemen converged on Field 12, believing they were hunting a squad-sized American assault. They found one man, bleeding from 2 wounds, using a hedgerow's shadow and a scavenged rifle to fire from angles their doctrine had never trained them to expect. In the 11 minutes that followed, Calloway did not stop moving. He never held a static position long enough for suppressing fire to find him. He used the mirror sight to place shots around corners no rifleman should have been able to see. By 7:17 hours, the field was silent. Stop. Look at what just happened. Field 12, St. Lo Sector, July 11, 1944, 3:47 to 7:17 hours. Before, enemy position, 8 riflemen, 1 MG-42 emplacement, held ground of approximately 400 meters of Hedgerow frontage. Friendly forces available to Callaway. 1 man, 1 improvised hybrid rifle, 41 total rounds of ammunition across all sources. After, enemy casualties confirmed. 6 killed, 2 wounded and captured. MG-42 position neutralized, ground retaken. 400 meters of Hedgerow frontage, opening the division's advance route toward St. Lo. American lives estimated saved by removal of the MG-42 nest before the planned dawn assault. Approximately 40-60 men of the following company push, ammunition expended by Callaway. 34 of 41 rounds, time elapsed. 30 minutes. 1 man. Those numbers. Sit with that. The battle wasn't over. Word of the silenced MG-42 spread down the Hedgerow line through the morning, and by the time the sun was fully up, 23 more German soldiers along adjacent positions had either surrendered to the advancing American push or been confirmed casualties in the fighting that followed, fighting made possible only because the gun that had pinned them for 5 weeks was gone. Later accounts, pieced together by battalion intelligence over the following days, would attribute the total collapse of that stretch of the German Hedgerow defense, 29 men, killed, captured, or routed, to the action that began in a drainage ditch at 3:47 hours. The final sensory signature moment came just before the third peak, in the quiet after the field went silent, and before he moved toward the last German strongpoint holding the eastern hedge line. He knelt in the wheat, pressed his thumb into the scar on his palm, slow, deliberate, the way his father had taught him without ever using the word teach, and felt the sting the way he always did. Then he stood and he moved. The third peak, the thing no one who was there ever forgot. Alone, wounded on his last handful of rounds, Callaway walked the final 80 yards of open hedgerow in full view of the last German position and did not run. He fired from the hip using the Thompson housing's remaining rounds, then finished the position with the Kar 98K Garand hybrid at 19 yards, the mirror sight now cracked and useless, aiming purely by feel, the same feel his hands had learned at a forge in Georgia 20 years earlier. Enemy POV. Hartman stands at the map table and says nothing for a long moment after the final report comes in. 29 men, 1 position. He has fought since Poland, and he has never filed a report like this one. He tells Lieutenant Braun to record it precisely, without exaggeration, because no one at division headquarters will believe it otherwise. Then he says the line his second-in-command will repeat for the rest of his own life. We were not defeated by an army this morning. We were defeated by 1 man who refused to stop. He does not say it with anger. He says it the way 1 soldier speaks of another. Then came the silence, not relief, not celebration, just wait. Callaway sat down in the wheat because his legs finally let him, blood soaking through the makeshift bandage on his arm, ribs screaming with every breath. When the rest of his company finally advanced through the cleared field 40 minutes later, they found him sitting there, rifle across his knees, saying nothing. Nobody cheered. Nobody knew yet what to say. They just stood there looking at 1 man and 1 broken entry-built rifle, and understood without a word being spoken that something had happened in that field that none of them would ever be able to fully explain to anyone who hadn't seen it. 29 men, 34 rounds. Comment 1 man if that number just leveled you. Subscribe before the legacy section. It's not the ending you expect. The immediate aftermath was smaller than the moment deserved. Field 12 opened the division's route toward St. Lo by nearly 2 days ahead of the original timetable. The captured MG-42 position was logged, the enemy casualties were logged, and the action that caused it was folded into a single line in the battalion after-action report. Enemy strongpoint neutralized by forward elements. Advance resumed 7:45 hours. No name attached. Sergeant Delacroix Hayes, in his own report, made no mention of having left Calloway behind, and no mention of who had actually cleared the field. Calloway was awarded nothing at the time. 2 white privates from a neighboring platoon were commended for supporting the advance through Field 12, men who arrived after the field was already silent. Calloway spent 3 weeks in a field hospital for his arm and ribs, then rejoined his unit and never once brought it up. When a lieutenant asked him directly, weeks later, what had happened out there, Calloway reportedly said only, "Fixed a problem, kept moving." It is the only first-hand quote of his that survives in any written record. Historically, the collapse of the German Hedgerow defense along that stretch did shift tactics for the rest of the Normandy campaign. After-action reviews from late July 1944 increasingly recommended small, mobile fire teams for hedgerow clearing rather than full squad advances, a lesson the Army had been slow to learn through 5 brutal weeks of bocage fighting. The division's own historian, writing decades later in a unit history that dedicated barely a paragraph to Field 12, noted only that an unnamed forward element had accelerated the advance by an estimated day and a half, a delay that, multiplied across the exhausted, bled-down companies still fighting through the bocage that week, likely meant fewer men lost to the grinding attrition of hedgerow-to-hedgerow combat in the days that followed. No name, no citation. Just an unnamed forward element, doing what an entire company had been unable to do, and then disappearing back into the ranks as if nothing had happened at all. Witness testimony. I was the last man in that position. I did not fire my weapon. I watched him come through the wheat, and I understood there was no version of the next 10 seconds where I survived by fighting. I raised my hands. He could have shot me, I expected it. He did not. He checked my hands were empty, said one word I did not understand, and moved past me toward the command post. I have thought about that word for months. I still don't know what it was. The racial abuse angle never resolved into anything clean. Calloway was never formally recognized for Field 12 during the war. A recommendation for the Distinguished Service Cross, drafted by a company clerk who had heard the story secondhand, was reportedly lost in the transfer of paperwork between units. Whether through negligence or something less accidental, no surviving record says. He finished the war as a private first class, 3 ranks below where his record should have placed him. One brief note belongs here, and only here. The wounded German soldier in the ditch, and the choice Calloway made about him, appears nowhere in any official account. It exists only in the space between what happened and what got written down. He never spoke of it, and this account does not judge him for it. It simply notes that it happened. Jubal Calloway went home to Coweta County in 1946. He reopened his father's forge, which had sat cold for 4 years, and ran it for another 30. He never gave an interview about the war. He told his own children almost nothing, except once, late in his life, when his youngest daughter found an old, cracked signal mirror in a cigar box in his workshop and asked what it was. He told her it used to belong to a rifle that didn't exist anymore, and that was all he said. The scar on his palm stayed with him until he died in 1988. The mirror from the rifle's sight was kept in that cigar box for the rest of his life. After his death, his family donated it, along with a handwritten note describing Field 12 in 4 sentences, to a small county historical society in Georgia, where it remains today, unlabeled, in a drawer waiting for someone to ask the right question. His forge outlived him by only a few years before a fire, unrelated, electrical, Nothing symbolic about it except in hindsight. Took the old stone building down to its foundation in 1994. By then, 3 generations of Callaways had learned to work iron in that same space. None of them ever told the full story of what their father and grandfather had done in a wheat field outside St. Lo. His daughter, the one who found the mirror, would later say the family didn't learn the scope of what happened at Field 12 until a military historian researching the 29th Division's Hedgerow campaign tracked down surviving fragments of the story nearly 60 years later, cross-referencing a captured German officer's diary entry, a partial after-action report, and Corporal Reis's post-war testimony, none of which had ever been assembled together until then. By the time the pieces came together, Jubal Callaway had been dead for over a decade, and there was no one left to ask what that one unintelligible word to Corporal Reis had actually been. There are thousands of men like Jubal Callaway buried in the footnotes of the Second World War, soldiers who did something no training manual could have prepared them for, and then went home and said almost nothing about it, because nobody ever asked, and because the country they fought for wasn't always ready to listen. What Field 12 means today isn't really about the 29 men, or the rifle, or even the silence. It's about how easily a single line in an after-action report can erase what actually happened to a human being under fire, and how long it can take, sometimes generations, for the truth to catch back up to the record. Think about how close this story came to disappearing entirely. A misfiled recommendation, a commander who never wrote down what he saw, a private who never gave an interview. If a handful of scattered records hadn't survived, a diary entry from a man on the other side of the field, a mirror kept in a cigar box, a historian willing to spend years chasing down fragments, none of us would know Jubal Callaway's name today. How many more Field 12s never got even that much? How many forges went cold with the whole story locked inside them? There is one thing that record does not show. 2 days after the fighting at Field 12, a German officer's sidearm, engraved non-standard issue, not matching any weapon logged among the captured or the dead in that sector, turned up in the personal effects Callaway shipped home at the end of his tour. No American after-action report from that stretch of Hedgerow mentions a captured officer's weapon. No German record places an officer at that position at all. Nobody ever asked Callaway where it came from. He died in 1988. He never gave an interview. Maybe it means nothing, or maybe it means everything. If this story found you, if this name meant nothing to you an hour ago and now it means something, then leave his name in the comments. Just his name, nothing else. Let's build him a memorial right here in this comment section where history forgot to put one. Subscribe, because there are hundreds more of them, forgotten, waiting, and they deserve to be found.